Cassie had said something about D-Rock being head of Puff's security after I had left.
So it meant a lot to me to actually have the opportunity to work with somebody of that magnitude.
What is the job of an executive assistant? What do you do?
Well, the job of an executive assistant is to staff him. 24/7, essentially, he needs staffing.
Puff may have promised D-Rock something to help him get big to that party.
Would go to a hotel room or be at his home, his bedroom, and they would have intimate gatherings.
Cocaine is a hell of a drug.
What happens when one of the biggest names in music faces courtroom revelations they never expected to hear in today's video? We're diving into the explosive testimony of Diddy's former assistant, the jaw-dropping allegations of freak-off nights, an outrageous
On us. We had the mushrooms on us. We had a kind of a Diddy pack is what they would call it, and we would keep a satchel on us, and that's what we would have in that satchel. They were referred to me as Wild King Nights, and what a Wild King Night was when him and a guest would go to a hotel room or be at his home, his bedroom, and they would have intimate gatherings. I would have to go and prep that hotel room, which consisted of baby oil Astroglide, candles, incense, liquor, lights, tons of toiletries, drugs. I had no idea that he had this other side to him. And when I started to get exposed to his lifestyle, I started to really realize, like, this guy has an addiction. It's not just, once every few weeks, it's every day, every hour.
Hey, yo, Phil, can y'all come straighten it up over here? Not looking luxurious.
The personal assistant also became the personal maid. Diddy's sex parties meant hotel rooms were often trashed. Phil was expected to get his hands dirty cleaning up, with the priority being to ensure no evidence was left behind. No secrets could ever escape.
Initially, when you walk in, you have to start to clean up the mess and the records that's left from the room. And that's the alcohol that's halfway open. Some bottles are cracked, glasses are cracked. There's baby oil everywhere on the floors in the bathroom. There's lube everywhere, half open, some of it oozing off the sides. And you have to get all that stuff, clean it up. Luckily, I would wear even a mask and I would wear gloves, because it was disgusting.
Phil, what would have happened if you said to Diddy, look, that's just not my job, I'm not going to do it?
If I said that to Diddy, I wouldn't have worked there.
The moment Diddy's former assistant stepped up to testify, the courtroom fell silent. All eyes were on them. This was someone who had practically lived in Diddy's shadow, privy to details that no one else would have imagined. As Diddy sat at the defense table avoiding direct eye contact, the assistant began their testimony, instantly commanding attention with their clear and steady voice. They weren't just an employee, they were the type of insider who knew the rhythms of his life from business to personal indulgences. They described their role in painstaking detail, reinforcing their credibility. As more than just a bystander to the events in question, it wasn't long before they addressed what had been murmured about for years, the so-called freak-off nights. The assistant's tone didn't waver as they recounted the lavish and secretive nature of these events, painting a picture that shocked everyone in earshot. It wasn't just about extravagant parties. These were nights cloaked in extreme secrecy, attended by select insiders where, according to the testimony, control was everything. These freak-offs, as they were referred to, were described as intricate productions, carefully curated by Diddy himself. Invitations weren't handed out lightly, and every detail from the guest list to the atmosphere was managed to strict specifications. It was no ordinary gathering, it was excess at its most calculated. The assistant then revealed chilling demands that, according to them, were made to fulfill Diddy's expectations. During these nights, they recounted being tasked with arranging uncomfortably specific accommodations for these events, characterizing the process as dehumanizing. The assistant alleged that their job was to ensure attendees adhered to unspoken rules designed to protect secrecy, intimating that the consequences of breaking those rules were severe. As they revealed this, there were audible gasps from the gallery, and even the attorneys exchanged brief, tense glances. The air in the room shifted, growing heavier with each passing sentence. The judge appeared impassive, but attentive, scribbling notes periodically. Though some of the jury members seemed visibly uncomfortable, one attendee later speaking to reporters described the audience as being on edge, hanging on every word when it came time for specifics. The assistant didn't pull punches. They spoke about an incident where they were allegedly forced to mediate between Diddy and an uncooperative guest, saying, "It didn't matter how far it went, he'd stop at nothing to control everything about that night." At the mention of this particular event, Diddy shifted in his seat. He rubbed his eyes, adjusted his tie, and let out an audible sigh. It was one of the first signs of visible reaction from him during this segment of the trial, though the assistant continued with more accounts. The tension in Diddy's demeanor grew, signaling the weight of what had been disclosed for now. Though the courtroom paused on the image of one specific incident, an explosive secret brought to light, one that few could have anticipated. And this wasn't even the only voice that planned to speak out. There was more yet to come.
See, Cassie told the story on the witness stand about how Puff and her was in a freak off, and then D-Rock intervened or whatever like that, and they masked themselves up in all black, took the guns out the safe, and went to find Suge. You know what I'm saying? Suge even spoke about he's glad they didn't find him because a whole lot of other people probably been dead then too, you know, if they would have found him. Now she testified that, you know, Puff and D-Rock was going to try to, you know, unalive Suge. You know what I'm saying? Now, what I do know this, me and D-Rock had a conversation about why he's so close to Puff now. You understand? And he told me he was in a diner, Mel's Diner. I guess it was probably Mel's Diner. That's one of the diners that stay late open in California. He said that he was trapped in there and he ain't have no burners or nothing on him. He ain't have no guns, no nothing. He said he called Puff. Now this is a story coming from D-Rock. He said he called Puff and Puff came there. But if Puff would have came in the diner, they would have known something. He didn't come to the diner. He sent Cassie in there with the burners. And Cassie gave D-Rock the gun in the diner. Now this is coming from D-Rock. The story Cassie told is that it was a whole different story from what D-Rock had told me, because D-Rock said he was in the diner himself. And Puff came down there with the guns, sent Cassie in there and gave him one, and was outside waiting on him to come outside. So that's the story that I knew, and I had already said that and expressed that in one of my shows before. Now, the story Cassie told is like she saw D-Rock and Puff both put on black and went to go unalive Suge. So those are two different stories that I know of. You know, one from D-Rock and the one we heard from Cassie. It may be the same story and Cassie just flipped it some kind of way. Because D-Rock told me this years ago. And then maybe Cassie just, you know, flipped it in a certain kind of way because
The courtroom was unnervingly quiet as the former assistant continued their testimony at the defense table. Diddy sat, rigid hands clasped in front of him, his jaw visibly tight. His usual air of confidence seemed replaced with a restrained tension for the first half hour of testimony. He didn't flinch, eyes fixed downward, his face carved into an expressionless mask. But anyone paying close attention could see the cracks beginning to form, the subtle movements, fidgeting with his tie, leaning forward slightly, and then leaning back, hinted at the storm building beneath the surface as the assistant's words painted a vivid picture of the so-called freak-off night's. Murmurs began to ripple through the gallery. The descriptions weren't just about lavish gatherings. They dove straight into the troubling demands allegedly made by Diddy. The assistant described nights where secrecy was paramount, where control over guest actions wasn't merely suggested, but strictly enforced at one point as the assistant recounted a particularly disturbing incident involving a guest who had been ejected for breaking an unspoken rule. Diddy glanced sharply toward his defense team, his expression briefly shifting to something between frustration and disbelief. The gallery wasn't immune to the momentum of the testimony. There were hushed whispers with some spectators leaning toward each other exchanging quick, wide-eyed glances outside the courtroom. Reporters were glued to their phones, sending out live updates as the testimony progressed. Some legal analysts later remarked that the atmosphere inside the room felt intense enough to cut with a knife. One bystander described it as a slow unraveling, a boiling pot ready to spill over as the testimony went into greater detail. Diddy's mask began to slip further. Witnesses in the room described him exhaling deeply, clasping and unclasping his hands, and looking more visibly agitated as the assistant delved into specific accounts of behavior they were instructed to ignore or enable when one particularly unsettling detail emerged. An account of a guest being pressured into compliance by Diddy. Himself, someone in the audience audibly gasped. That was when Diddy's composure finally cracked. According to courtroom observers, Diddy leaned over to his attorney with a sharp, audible whisper, though the words were unclear to those seated in the gallery. His tone carried unmistakable frustration. Moments later, as the assistant continued to speak, he sat back abruptly, shaking his head and muttering something under his breath. The motion was small, but unmistakable. A rare and raw reaction from a man who had by then been visibly containing himself for hours. It left no doubt that the testimony was striking a nerve for legal experts watching the case. This kind of visible reaction wasn't surprising public figures, especially those used to controlling their image can find it difficult to face deeply personal or damaging accusations in a public, highly scrutinized setting. The courtroom is an equalizer. One analyst commented, "The glamour and mystique of celebrity don't matter when your character is being pulled apart word by word." In Diddy's case, the assistant's revelations touched on areas of his private life that had long been shielded by a carefully crafted public image, and the cracks were now showing by the time the session adjourned for the day. It was clear the impact this testimony had on Diddy. While leaving the courtroom, he avoided eye contact with reporters and brushed past the crowd more briskly than usual. But inside, his reactions had already added an extra layer of weight to the assistant's claims. A hint some suggested of his awareness of the gravity of the situation.
At that party, because Puff is the one who, and you'll see in Kirk Burroughs' papers, that Puff was the one who scratched out Big Trip from going to London, and then turned around and lied that Big didn't want to go to London, which was a bunch of crap. You understand what I'm saying? Because he asked Clark Kent to go to London with him. He asked Clark Kent to go to London with him. And Clark Kent was going to go to London with him, God bless the dead. You understand? Clark Kent told that story. Now, in this trial, Cassie was telling how D-Rock and Puff was trying to line Suge Knight up. But like I said, I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm just going to get into the fact that D-Rock has been with Puff since Big died. You understand? He went and did a little time, and when he was in jail, he was letting everybody know when he come home, Puff was going to take care of him. And he became head of Puff security, making sure Puff was all right. Puff also gave him that clothing line, which was Bully. It was Big's ideal, but it was Invisible Bully. You understand? Gave him that clothing line. They was doing a little work, and he was doing the t-shirts and everything like that. And I guess Puff was actually, paying him back for helping him get big to that party. I'm glad Miss Wallace ain't here, brother, to see and hear what we're finding out about D-Rock now and the things that he did and how he was, so close to Puff and doing some of the things with Puff. And it's crazy right now. I'm glad Miss Wallace is not here to hear that.
Courtroom was still reeling from the assistant's revelations when Gandil, a former bodyguard and longtime confidant of Diddy, was called to testify. His presence immediately added weight to the proceedings. Gan Deal wasn't just any witness. He was there during the height of Diddy's influence and could speak to the kind of access only a trusted insider would have, while his connection to Diddy had soured. Years ago, his testimony promised to either corroborate the troubling picture painted by the assistant or tear it apart entirely. Everyone in the courtroom knew the stakes. Gene's demeanor struck a sharp contrast to previous witnesses, calm and deliberate. In his responses, he seemed intent on making his position clear. "I saw things firsthand," he said early on, setting the tone for what would be a pointed and unflinching account. As reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, Gan began recounting details of the infamous freak-off nights, details that matched and at times went beyond the assistant's earlier claims. Gene elaborated on how these parties were meticulously planned, describing them as controlled chaos. According to him, these gatherings weren't just about indulgence, they were calculated to maintain power dynamics where guests were pressured into compliance under the guise of exclusivity. What made Gan's testimony so striking wasn't just the consistency with prior allegations, but the specificity of his accounts. One incident in particular stood out. Gene described an evening where he alleged that Diddy personally directed staff to enforce strict participation rules. He wanted it all to go exactly as planned. Anyone not playing along wasn't just asked to leave, they were humiliated, Gene said. The gallery sat frozen as he recounted the pressure tactics used to isolate and intimidate individuals. At the parties, Diddy at the defense table clenched his jaw, but otherwise remained outwardly composed. Still, his shoulders were tense, his foot tapping sporadically as Gene continued adding to the drama. Gene claimed that secrecy wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded outright. He revealed that phones were confiscated at the door, and staff were sworn to silence about what took place behind closed doors. His words painted a picture of tightly guarded events intended to shield Diddy from public scrutiny. The prosecution emphasized this point, framing the secrecy as evidence of Diddy's awareness of how damaging these alleged activities could be. If ever exposed, Gene's decision to testify appeared as much about clearing his conscience as delivering a blow to Diddy. He said, "For years I stayed quiet out of loyalty, but this has gone too far." His motivations, though likely complex, added a layer of authenticity to his words. By the end of Gene's testimony, it was clear his statements aligned with much of the assistant's account, creating a narrative the defense struggled to discredit for the jury. His revelations may have been the most compelling. Yet Gene Deal had done more than corroborate allegations. He'd laid the foundation for a version of Diddy's private life that, if believed, could change everything.